Hi guys, my name is Ryan. Last name is Reiss. It's spelled R-E-I-S-S. I am known as well as Intoxable as part of Intoxicated Meta, which is my YouTube channel. I'm gonna be here today to talk to you guys about story arcs and basically just tying everything together that goes with those types of story arcs. So first of all, we'll do story arc introductions and the kind of things that you need to have to build a good story arc for your D&D campaign. Now, this can be used for pretty much any type of campaign, but I mainly gear my play style and story building towards 5e, 5th edition. So, to begin things, you always want to have some type of introduction, in my opinion. You want to have something that allows your players to more or less gear their backstories towards, which we'll get onto backstories, but you want to have mainly a good goal or plot plan that you can write. If you want to have a short game, I'd say anywhere from 3 to 5 arcs. If you want to have a much larger campaign, up in the 14 through level 20, it's safe to have around 8 to 10 arcs, I would say. And they don't all have to go together. They just have to be something that is introduced, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. What I like to do is kind of mix it up and put multiple bad guys in those arcs. Introduce them early, even though they might be a late game boss, or it's D&D. They might actually defeat them early, and that can completely change the story around, even maybe derail your plans. But you got to remember, this is Dungeons and Dragons, so do not ever force your characters into a particular story arc or a particular way. You keep that to yourself as a DM, and what you want to do is basically slowly transition them back on track, even when they may think they want to do their own thing or that they are doing their own thing. So for an example of this is, they're like, we want to go west. Well, west is not where your story arc was kind of gearing towards in your head. Just slowly transition it to that. If they're going to go west or east and your plan was the opposite, make it east or west. And just introduce that story plan at that point. So what we're going to do first, as far as this, that was more or less the introduction, we're going to go into character backstories. So on character backstories, what you essentially want to do is, before a campaign begins, you need to have particular things to get it going for from your players. You need to have their stats, their race, their name, their class, and I always say a backstory. You don't necessarily have to have one, but story arcs are really hard to write and do and grasp interest from your players if you do not have a good story. People who just want to fight things all the time, I don't even recommend playing Dungeons and Dragons. I recommend just doing Battle Royale one-shots, or even possibly high-level in-game content one-shots. If all your players ever want to do is fight, that's better geared towards them. D&D is about not just fighting. It's about role-playing. It's about story. It's about lots of different things that all come together into one fantastic game. So getting a little off track here. So backstories. I require my players to have some resemblance of a backstory. If they are not creative enough to make one, I will assist them with it, or I will introduce one, especially if they're a new player and they're still trying to get comfortable with everything. And a good backstory is going to have 3 main elements. It is going to have some type of origin of why it came to be. It is going to have a long-term goal. And it is going to, in my opinion, the third and most important is some type of antagonist. Now, the antagonist does not have to be a person, per se. It could be an event. It could be a problem. It could be a catastrophic situation. It could be all kinds of different things. It's a little bit more, like, immersive, in my opinion, if it is a character that you can actually introduce and roleplay. That character could be tons of different things. It could be a known wizard that is surely going to get you, or it could be something as deep as a dragonborn sorcerer who will have his revenge. It could be as simple as that. It could also be, it could be something as simple as a disagreement with a family member that went rogue, and the whole like long-term revenge plot against a parent. To give you an example, I have one player who she didn't want to make her own because she's newer to the game and she was nervous to do it. So she was basically a tiefling cleric of life, and I said, well, how about you have a sister who is a tiefling cleric of death that killed your family and has always been kind of, a little quirky and a little hot-headed and dangerous, and basically you went life cleric because you worship life and wish you could bring your parents back, and she worships death and is glad they're dead. And she loved it. So, and that took me 15 seconds to create. I'm not saying it's a super unique backstory, but it's something to work with. So that's an example of a good backstory. So, or a backstory in general. So when your players all give you these backstories, it is your job as the DM in a story-driven campaign to tie all these together. And if you do it correctly and you do it with good story plots, and you take what I like to call filler campaign, which is basically just little things in between. Could be extra story, it could be some type of thing that's going on, it could be a rogue point that gets introduced into it. There's all kinds of different ways to do this. For instance, I have a group of individuals that are called the Nova Guard that show up every once and again. It's a group of individuals that are either fire-based or they are immune to fire, based on the fact that they are fire-based or based on some type of unique talent or ability. And they are pretty much an evil society that is seeking a certain type of revenge plot that somewhat appeals to all of the backstories in one way or another, but they are very seldomly introduced, so it's something that I can always go back to or use as a random point of interest. So, for instance, they showed up recently in my current campaign that everybody's level 14 in. They started at level 2, and they're currently level 14. Well, they introduced them, and none of them have any idea who they are, except for one player, because I used a name that was familiar to his story, introduced it into my own type of background and arc, and it completely ignited an entire series of stories, questions, interest, excitement, and it's just things like that more or less make a backstory fantastic. So moving on to our second point, we're going to talk about, which transitions right into this, we're going to talk about story arcs. Okay, so story arcs are, especially, these are fantastic to have, unless you're just going to do a wide open world with no real purpose, which, most RPG games like the Witcher series and Skyrim and stuff like that have end goal points, but they are also open world to the point that you could literally just never achieve the point and just continuously run around and do shit. That's cool. It's not my style of DMing. I like to have goals. I like to have things that eventually get to a point and conclude. Now, it's not to say that I don't allow that and that I don't do that, because I do. Every good DM should. You don't always want to hardcore control the concept of the adventure. You want things to build. Some of the best stories come from people going off the wall or breaking the fourth wall, or things like that. So story arcs. Let's say you have 4 players, which is the average size group of D&D. So let's say you have 4 players, and all 4 of them have pretty different backstories, and you want to start building arcs. Well, what I would say is the best thing to do is read over those backstories, find out which ones are going to be the easiest to introduce in your plans and in your world, whether that's including filler information or not filler information. And then essentially what you would be able to do with those backstories and arcs is have 4 arcs pre-built. Just take each one of their backstories and have them achieve each arc from each backstory forward. If they don't have an antagonist, create one. That's the beauty of D&D. Sometimes it's 100% improv. One thing I will say, and a lot of DMs will agree with me on this, do not ever overplan a campaign. The most you should put into each new idea before a campaign is like doing its next game, I would say 1-2 hours tops. Even that's a little overkill. You're going to find out, and which I have in 10 years of experience, that you can plan all you want, but nothing is ever going to go 100% according to plan, which most people are going to know that. So plan, but don't overplan, because you don't want to be disappointed and you don't want to lose grasp on your story or your players. If you lose grasp on your players, they are going to start walking all over you, walking over the game. They're going to realize that you can't keep things together. They're going to potentially start losing interest in the game itself if you're not able to keep good control over the story and over the players. I will actually have a later video that explains all the different things that you might have to deal with as a DM, all the different types of players, and there's basically titles for each of them because they're so common in this type of environment, in this type of community. And basically it'll just be helpful tips to deal with them. The answer is never kick the player out. That's never the answer. Even if you might really dislike that person, there's all kinds of factors that can go into why a player acts the way they can. It could be many things. It could be real-life problems. It could be past DMs that didn't know what they were doing. I'll give you examples of that as well. But we'll go into that in another series. For now, let's get back on track. So the story arcs and the backstories. So the best way to build a story arc is to know what city your players are going to start in or meet in, or how you're going to introduce them. That can be one of the most difficult things in D&D, is having a good way to introduce players. I will give you a couple examples. An example of a good way to introduce players, you could always do the cliche, we met in a bar. People say that that's too cliche to use. I disagree. Matthew Mercer did it with campaign number 2 in Critical Role, and because of how amazingly skilled he is, he pulled it off 110%. I mean, like, that was one of the best introductions I've seen in a D&D campaign, and I'm not surprised because it was done by the demigod himself. So, the golden child of D&D. So, you can use that. If you do it properly, you can do that. A good way of doing that properly is not rushing the story, allowing the players to completely RP with one another, no matter how silly it might be. That's more or less, when you introduce something like that, you're just going to sit back and watch. You might as well pop some popcorn, because you are not going to be able to interact as much in that type of introduction, because it is 98% the players when you introduce everybody in one setting, in one area. It's the way that they introduce themselves, it's the way they develop their characters, it's first impressions, it's all that stuff. Now, an example of a situation where you are more in control. You could have a group of people that happen to be watching a local fight. Even one of your players could possibly be in the local fight. You could basically have people walking around saying, fresh beverages, fresh food, and you can have different things that the players, to keep the players immersed in the world. You could have somebody say, we're taking bets, place your bets here, and you can have people come up, place bets, win a little bit of coin. I can tell you, anything that you're going to introduce coin to a player, they're going to love it. Even though you can sometimes achieve a lot of things in D&D without coin, I'm going to tell you the two most important things that players want in a D&D campaign is valuables, gold items, stuff like that, magical abilities, magical ways to unlock additional stat points, like basically tombs to give like +2 to intellect or charisma or whatever else once you've read them long enough. And then the second thing, of course, is leveling. And that's the second most important thing. Players want to know when they're leveling. I mean, I typically am asked at the end of every single campaign, since I prefer milestone over experience, which a lot of DMs are switching to, I've noticed, especially in 5th edition. They want to know if they're leveling. Well, typically, you gain a level after the end of each minor or major story arc. Now, my story arcs are a little bit different. I'm going to go into that. My story arcs, I always have one major arc that has about 3 or 4 what you might call acts in each arc. Typically, an antagonist of that arc is going to be introduced either in the first act or the 4th act of that arc. And what I mean by that is, let's say somebody knew this local hag that was basically running a series of unfortunate events on the people that were in the city. Well, the player is going to introduce that sheerly by conversation with the other players. Well, one thing will move to another, and the player will start seeing that stuff unlock, see that stuff start becoming reality based off the person's story arc. Excuse me. So, with that being said, you can slowly introduce it that way. The first act could just be basically a townsperson that comes running into the town and says, "We were ambushed. We were ambushed by an ugly woman. She had powers I've never seen before." And they'll be like, the players will probably ask questions like, "Where did you see this? What did she look like? What did she do? What kind of powers are we talking about here, bro?" Depending on what kind of players you have. And that will introduce two things. That will bring the player's story to life, which is going to immerse their, depending how into it they are, is going to basically open up their eyes to, hey, this shit's about me. The second thing it's going to introduce is, hey, we have a chance to go do something to get some valuables. We can get some experience. This is a whole lot better than just clearing out rats in a sewer. So your players are now, they are ready to more or less get in there and find out what's going on. So that can be Act 1. You could do an entire session on that. Act number 2 could be heading to this location that was specified, gathering clues, figuring out where you need to go. That is easily be Act number 2. Then Act number 3 could be, you could do something as far as completing that arc at Act number 3, or you could throw him a curveball and be like, "Yay, we defeated him. Oh wait, this is not the hag we're looking for. This is something else. This is a distraction. We killed a tree because we thought it was something important." Damn hags and their magic. So that's a really good way to do a very easy arc. I will tell you, my next campaign, my Every Other Saturday campaign that I'm getting ready to, not my Every Other Saturday campaign. That one's established. That one's more or less a type of like, more or less like a hosted entity that split itself into 3 major entities that swam off into different directions, and they are bringing all kinds of chaos and like organic and bacterial things along with them. Excuse me. So, more or less, that's being introduced on its own because they know that they have 3 major things now that they have to hunt down and find out, and that opens up all kinds of arcs. You can even throw like a curveball arc in there that's not a part of the other arcs. So basically, that's my Every Other Saturday campaign. My every Tuesday campaign, they're almost completing their current one, and the new one is going to be very time involved, like time travel, things, a society that used to exist long ago that was wiped out by a more or less like a system of balance that the world created. So that one's going to be very detailed and very story driven, because when you play with time, you got to be very careful with how you do things, because it's so easy to get lost in translation and to mix things up. So you have to have very good notes, and you have to be very good at improv as well as keeping up with all the details of what's going on. So I'm looking forward to challenging myself in a very time and specifics detailed campaign. So you can have arcs that go that in depth, and when you do that, that's great. But just remember, you need to keep your players interested. So listen to your players, watch your players, see how they interact. If they love to role play with each other, give them more opportunities to role play with each other. If they enjoy other things, like fighting, throw them a couple fights. The average D&D game of anywhere from 3.5 to 4 hours should have anywhere from 1 to 2 fights, if it is going to be a continuously driven story of following the arcs. That's not to say that you can't have a 4, 5, 6, 7 hour session if you're a hardcore player that is no fights. It's perfectly okay. I like the fighting system in 5th edition, so I like to throw usually 1 or 2 fights in each episode, but or campaign, I should say, but session that we have. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to do it every single time. I've had many games where there was not a single fight in 3.5, 4 hours. Okay, so that concludes my version of story arcs. So let's move on to the third part of this video, which is going to be introducing bad guys. Okay, so when you introduce bad guys, you can do this so many ways. In my opinion, the best ways to introduce bad guys are going to be slowly hint at things about these bad guys, hype them up, make when they finally are introduced that it's like, oh crap, this is that John Doe we've been hearing about. Might want to be a little careful around this guy. Arm some of our spells, save some of our slots. Well, that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is, introduce a huge baddie that they have to otherwise say, we're not going to win this fight. Let's go. Oh, you want to stay? Okay, well, we'll put that on your tombstone. So, more or less, you can introduce very powerful bad guys. Like in one of my campaigns, at level 6, I introduced an ancient blue dragon named Armanthriel, and they were smart enough to know not to fight him. He didn't land and say, I'm going to kill you now. He basically landed and said, I have something for you to do now. And he sounded like this. So he more or less gave them a story, gave them some story, gave them a goal that he wanted achieved, because there was a magic that was holding him back from doing what he wanted to do. It was also disallowing him to do anything about it. So he knew that this group was powerful enough to deal with his problems, and sure enough, they did. And in exchange, he gave them a part of this blade that they had been looking for to stop a bigger bad guy. So see, that's the nice thing about bad guys, is you can have them bounce off of each other's stories. You can have them introduce one bad guy in Act 1 who's not actually going to become a fightable bad guy until until Arc 3 or 4. Even 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, however many you're going to have. So having bad guys that correlate to one another, and sometimes not even correlate to one another, is really good practice of bad guys. So another, I would say, not as oftenly used way of introducing bad guys, because it's very hard to pull off with players who more or less want to do perception checks and insight checks every 15 seconds. It's like, you walk into a store. Hello, would you like to buy some potions? They're half off today. Insight check! So, you have people who are like, don't trust anyone. So, they roll high enough, they might find something about that person they don't like, and then they're going to have a heat sink eye locked on that person for the rest of the campaign. Which, you're the DM. You can easily be like, oh, well, he has really high charisma, or he has really high insight, whatever. So, with that being said, you can more or less introduce bad guys in that way. And that is actually going to lead us into our final part of this video, which is tying things together. Okay, so in this final chapter of this, you basically, once you've created characters, whether that's through backstories or through your own creation, you are gonna, and once you've gotten some of your arcs, you at least want to have 1 or 2 arcs figured out, and then you can just start building stuff as you go, a couple hours at a time. If you're world building, you're looking at a lot longer than 2 hours. I typically do all my campaigns in Matthew Mercer's world, because not only is it amazing and amazingly detailed, it's my way of kind of, fulfilling my man crush of Matthew Mercer. So I more or less use his. I don't more or less. I use his world: Exandria, Taldore, Isra, Marquette, and lately they've been back and forth between Wildmount and Taldore. Most of them start in Taldore because I have the campaign book as well as the map, so it's really a lot easier to base them in that because I have so much more information, on-hand information. So okay, tying things together. So once you have your backstories, your antagonists figured out, your story arcs, and you've introduced at least one or two of the bad guys of your plan and your plot, you want to make sure that you have some way of tying these stories together. If you have like a really weird transition from one story to the next, that's sometimes going to be seen as a sign of disorganization or weakness as a DM. I mean, you may have that player that falls asleep at the game every time or is on their cell phone, and you could be like, you take 44 points of damage. He's like, okay, 44 points of damage. Doesn't even ask what happened. Clearly, he's interested. And then you have, people who are very good at note-taking, very good at details, very good at figuring things out. The first person to chime in when you're doing a puzzle, a story, a correlation of details. So you want to make sure that your stories transition pretty well. Now, you can also end an arc quickly. You can have a one-act or a two-act arc. I mean, it's just like they say, there is no requirement, no minimum pages that a chapter needs to be in a book. And D&D is just one really good book. That's 100% what it is. Any DM will tell you that. D&D is a book, a story, that you are the writer of. You're the author. So tying things together, just like in a good storybook, is going to be required. If you're going to do a picture-only book, that's great. I mean, it's something that's just so easy and so easy to transition from one step to the next. You could do a campaign for kids. I mean, you don't want to complicate things for kids. If you have a bunch of like 6 and 7-year-olds who want to play because they like to roll dice, they like to see the figurines, they like the setups, that's great. But when you start saying things like, you run into a society of elven druids who are against anti-disestablishmentarianism, the kids are going to be like, huh? So you want to make sure that you don't overcomplicate things when you're tying stories together, is what I'm saying. So more or less, have an arc, end an arc. If that transitions into another arc, that's perfect. If it doesn't, that's fine, as long as you have some way of tying some end goal into these arcs. Because if you just have, like, there's a evil witch that fell in a well, and you have to cleanse her and kill her, it's a pretty cool idea. If the next one is, there's an evil clown who's eating villagers, okay, we got him. And then you have, like, there's a bear shark that's roaming the countryside and killing passengers of wagons and villagers who just want to get fresh fish, but instead they're getting eaten by a horrible, terrible creature. Okay. I mean, we just killed a man-eating clown, so I think we can handle a shark, bear, fish thing. So that's cool and all, but those don't really in any way, shape, or form tie together. Now, if you get lazy with it and you're like, they were all cousins, I mean, it's like, okay. So, I mean, like, as a DM, you got to keep your players interested. You got to have a good story arc. You got to have a good way of transitioning into the next thing. Doesn't have to go together, but you want the end result to be some type of thing. You want the story to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you don't have all three of those, it gets kind of clunky. So just remember that. Guys, I am Ryan, and again, Ryan, R-E-I-S-S, pronounced Reiss, it's very German, on the Critical Role Fan Club and the Dungeons & Dragons group on Facebook. Always feel free to message me if you have any questions. I am more than happy to give my experience, my opinions. I think one of the greatest things that a DM, a dungeon master, or a game master, whatever you prefer to say, can do for another player is to help them so you can get more DMs and GMs out there who love what we do. I will always be available. I obviously have to sleep and work, but I will respond to you as soon as I possibly can. If you have any kind of questions, do not hesitate to ask. The only dumb question is asking if it's a dumb question, or not asking the question at all. So don't ever feel like it's a dumb question. We've all been there. We've all had that situation. So I'm happy to give my opinions, my knowledge, my experience. Might even learn something from you. So I mean, you learn something new every single day in D&D. Nobody has the entire thing memorized. I like to think that I'm pretty good, but there's always going to be a better person, unless you're Matthew Mercer. So with that concluded, just more or less message me if you need to. And I hope this was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next video. See you later.